I am going to begin by sending you good wishes from my colleague, Professor Jeff Thompson. Some of you who saw an earlier version of the program will have seen that he and I were supposed to be doing this session together, but Jeff hasn't been able to come this time, but he's asked me to give you all his very best wishes. What I'm going to talk about now, you can see the title is Asking Questions in Educational Research, and this is quite a challenge because I think at the very most I've got half an hour. It's the sort of thing I could happily lead a course on for a whole week, so I'm going to do my best to condense into 30 minutes something that I hope will be reasonably interesting. And I'm going to begin by making this point, because I think this is a really important point when we're talking about educational research, that all educators can engage in educational research. And I think sometimes there is a perception when we talk about research that we're talking always about very large research projects that can only be done by people with enormous amounts of research funding and huge teams of researchers. And of course, that's not the case. That is one possibility, that is one model. And I just want to emphasize today that research can be done by all educators, however large or small scale the context in which they're working. And I really just want to make a few points that are based around that theme. So I'm going to begin by saying that we need to be clear what we mean by educational research. So I am suggesting that educational research is, and I think probably the points that are made here would be reasonably non-contentious. But educational research clearly, as a statement of the obvious, is research undertaken with a focus on education. And it can take different forms. So we can have educational research that's what might be described as empirical, where we're gathering and analysing data, and that gathering and analysing of data will be informed through engagement with literature. So we will engage with literature and we'll engage with educational theories. But we can do research too, as an alternative, that does not have an empirical dimension, that does not include going out and gathering data, but is based entirely on engaging with literature sources, where you might argue that the data is the literature that you're engaging with, and the academic sources, the books and the articles that have been written by other researchers about their experiences of educational theory. And as I said before, educational research may be large scale or it may be small scale. And in different contexts, one or other will be appropriate. So how the questions are asked in educational research will depend upon a number of different issues. And these are really important points, I think. I think sometimes we have a tendency to jump in at the deep end with educational research and to rush at it and think that we have to start gathering data as soon as we possibly can. And of course, that's not always the best idea. If we start gathering data as soon as we can, but without really planning it carefully and not being really clear why we're doing it, then we can end up trying to unpick problems later on. So one of the really important points, I think, is what the question we're asking in educational research is trying to find out. What are we really trying to find out? And that links to why we are asking that question. Why do we want to know? Is it because we are being asked to answer this question by the head or the principal of our school? Are we engaging in this piece of research based around a particular research question because we want to know something ourselves? Or is there some other impetus that's causing us to do it? And that will influence how we ask the question. Who the answer to the question will be shared with. And that's again about why we're asking the question, why we're going to be doing the research. Are we going to answer this question for our own interest, so it informs our own practice in our classroom or our school? Or are we asking this question and setting out to answer it in order to share our findings with a wider constituency? Are we intending to share our findings with the head or the principal of our school? Are we intending to share our findings with all the other teachers in our school? Or or a wider constituency even than that. And that will affect, too, how we actually ask the question. And of course, how the questions are asked will also depend on the resources that we have available to us. If we are going to do a piece of small-scale research all by ourselves, then we will have very limited resources, probably. And that means that limited resources in terms of finance. We may not have any funding. We may be doing this ourselves without any funding at all. And of course, another important resource is time. How much time do we actually have to conduct this piece of research? And of course, another important dimension of all of this and how we're asking the question is what expertise we have. And this is always the big challenge. There are so many different methodologies, so many different ways that you could go about undertaking a piece of educational research. And I'm not going to start talking about all of those now. But one of the things that's really important is that while I'm emphasizing that all educators can undertake research, of course, if we're going to do the research in a way that leads to meaningful and valid conclusions, then we need to make sure we have the skills to do it. So that partly relates to not being over-ambitious in the methodologies and the methods we adopt. So that's an important dimension too. And that might link to where we might look for support. Who might we ask for support in helping us to develop the skills we need? If, for instance, we're going to develop a questionnaire. Developing a questionnaire is one of those aspects of educational research that looks a lot easier than it actually turns out to be when we do it. And, of course, the other thing that how we ask the questions will depend upon is the access we have to sources of research data. So where are we going to get the data from that will form the basis of our research if we're going to gather empirical data? Who will we gather it from? Will we be sending out questionnaires to lots of teachers? Will we be doing some sort of classroom observation with students? What access do we have? Will we be able to have access to those people? And whose permission do we need if we're going to undertake research? And of course, that's another dimension that's really important in any sort of research, the ethical dimension and issues of what's often referred to as informed consent, that those engaged in our research and supporting our research are actually doing so willingly and understanding what it is they're doing. So why might we want to undertake research then? I'll just say a little bit more about that. We might want to undertake educational research in our own classroom. As I said, we don't have to think of research as being enormous research projects. And if we want to do a piece of research in our own classroom to inform our own practice, that sort of approach is often referred to as action research. It's about something that is based in our own context to inform our day-to-day practice or our practice in relation to a particular aspect of our teaching. And of course, this sort of research, this sort of action research, is very similar to the sort of ongoing reflection that a lot of teachers are doing all the time. What we refer to very often as teachers being reflective practitioners, where we reflect on what we do and we think about what went well and what didn't go well and how we could improve it next time we do it. But the difference is if it's research, if it's formalized research, it's being done in a systematic way so that we can actually have confidence in the data we've gathered and in the conclusions we draw. We might want to undertake educational research in the whole school, so we might go beyond our classroom and we might want to undertake a piece of research that's about informing other colleagues or whole school practice or the development of a policy in our school maybe, so it might be something that's a bit broader than just our own classroom. We might be doing it in order to contribute to new understanding, to test current understanding, to solve problems, which is always a good basis for undertaking research, to try and improve a situation that's problematic, to improve practice very often, to enable the teacher to have a better understanding of their own practice, to inform decisions and to inform policy making. These are all good reasons for undertaking research that will give us some evidence that we can actually use then to decide how we might change practice in some way. And we might want to undertake educational research to inform the wider community. We may not be doing it only for our own interest. We might be wanting to inform other teachers. I put IB in brackets there, maybe other IB teachers in the IB context. And more widely than that, we might want to publish. We might want to think of publishing if we have done a larger piece of educational research and we can write it up appropriately. We might want to publish in an academic journal, or we might want to publish in something that has wider accessibility, that is read in schools around the world, maybe as a magazine or a journal of some sort, or maybe a blog or a website. It doesn't have to be a very formal sort of report on a piece of research. And of course, workshops are always a good way of disseminating and sharing the outcomes of research. And of course, it may be that research is part of feeding into the curriculum renewal process, that it's part of thinking about how we can renew, update the curriculum, and research that we undertake may well feed into all of that. So we might want to undertake educational research to understand a puzzling phenomenon, for instance. And I've put a few examples in here. So, for example, a question might be something like, why do girls do better than boys in some subjects at our school? It's that sort of question that often is around and is bothering us in schools and can be bothering us in an ongoing way for some time. And a piece of research might actually give us a bit more evidence to understand the situation better and then help us to know what we might do about it. Or it might be to investigate the effects of policy, and there's another example. How do recent changes in government education policy affect the implementation and organisation of the programmes in our school, which might be IB programmes, they might be other programmes. It might be about enhancing learning. How can I help IB diploma students to write better extended essays, for instance, is just one example. Or it might be about improving teaching. How can we raise the quality of discussion in IB theory of knowledge lessons in our school? And these are just examples. There are many, many more, of course, that we could come up with. And we might want to undertake educational research to provide evidence in a particular context for the information of some or all of those on the following list. So it might be for our own information, ourselves as teachers, managers, administrators, trainers. It might be for the information of our students, depending on what the topic is, our colleagues, our head of department, the head or the principal, the school board, parents, other constituencies. There's all sorts of reasons why we might want to undertake research and why issues arise. We might want to do it to enhance our own professional development. Maybe we just feel that it's about time we did something that would enhance our learning and our understanding of the context. It might be about improving our effectiveness as a professional. We might think that we've been doing the same job now for a number of years, and we'd really like to do something that would ensure that our practice is being developed. It can be very useful to have evidence that's been gathered systematically that we can base our conclusions on, sometimes called an audit trail. So we've actually got a basis on which we can see how a situation has arisen. And of course, some people do research to get a qualification, to do a qualification like a master's degree, say. And of course, sometimes people are doing research to help future researchers. And these categories are not discrete, they're not separate categories. We might be doing research for all of these reasons, or some of them at least. They might all overlap. And of course, we need to bear in mind that these are exciting times to be doing research in many respects, certainly in the context of international education. And in national systems around the world, there are so many developments, so many changes, there are so many things happening. So many challenges to teachers in schools that we are all facing, that an international education and other contexts, as I say, are growing and changing. And international education, if you're working in the context, say, of IB programs, it's still relatively new, this sort of approach to education. So it's a really good context to be doing research. And relatively little research has been done to date in this context in relation to implementing, say, the 4 IB programs. So all these things are changing, which means that there are great opportunities to be exploring them and seeing how our work in those contexts can be better understood and informed. And of course, those working in schools offering, for instance, the IB programs are in a terrific situation in terms of having access to a context where they can undertake research. So just a few points about what sorts of questions might be asked. If we are interested in international education, say, there might be different kinds of questions related to the nature of international education, how we translate that into practice, how we know those ideas are being implemented effectively. If we're talking about international education and its nature, we might be asking really interesting questions about what it means. What do we mean by international education? Is it about the very pragmatic dimensions that are about preparing young people for a future in a very different world than most of us grew up in, supporting them in developing pragmatic skills to do with fluency in languages, to do with intercultural literacy? Or is it more ideological? Is it about educating young people for a future where they will make a contribution to making the world a better place? So here's an example of a piece of research that might be considered related to the ideological on international mindedness, which some colleagues of mine in the Department of Education at the University of Bath undertook. And this was a piece of research that the IB made available some funding to enable my colleagues to travel to a number of schools around the world to interview students, to interview teachers. They also had an online questionnaire. And they were exploring the issue of the implementation of international mindedness across the IB continuum. And those are the details there if anyone's interested to look that up. But that was a bit of a larger project that had 5 or 6 people involved in it over a period of about 18 months. If we're thinking about translating ideas about international education into practice, say through the curriculum, we could think of examples like how can teachers best build on the curriculum that's intended to deliver, put in inverted commas, deliver, I don't really like the word, international education, say for instance in the context of particular programs like the IB programs, or in other international education programs, for instance, the International Primary Curriculum, some of you will be familiar with, International Middle Years Curriculum, the IGCSE, which is well known around the world. So we could be engaging in research that's about related to that curriculum context. There's research that could be done in the context of teachers, say, what skills do teachers need to deliver international education? Lots of interesting issues there for research. What are the implications for recruitment of teachers? Big issues about recruiting teachers to teach in schools around the world that are offering programs like the IB programs. And one of my colleagues, Michael Fertig at Bath, is researching in that sort of area. Interesting issues about how we prepare teachers to teach in the context of international education. And there's interesting programs now. There's a program called the International Teacher Education for Primary Schools program, which is specifically preparing young people to be teachers in international schools around the world. And of course, lots of issues that need researching about how teachers should be supported, how they can best be supported in this sort of context. Just a few points about leadership and management, another context which is just very well placed for research to be carried out. Lots of interesting questions about how schools should best be led and managed. Well, that's a question in itself. In the context of international education, the question might be how might they best be led and managed in order to promote international education? What particular skills might be needed by those who are leaders and managers in the context of schools, for instance, offering the IB programs? And Tristan Bonnell in my department at Bath, Michael Fertig, and then colleagues who are working with the IB, Jared Callan, Mark Waterson, Sue Richards and Darlene Fisher. They're doing work in this very area. So all sorts of interesting issues there. And then just a few points about how we know our ideas about promoting international education are being implemented effectively, and that's always an interesting point. We have aims and aspirations about our ideas in education, whatever context we're teaching in, how do we know that our aims are actually being implemented? Now, sometimes we can judge that by the results of exams and tests, but as we've been hearing throughout this conference, there is more to education than there is more to learning, and there's more to judging learning and the extent of learning than exams and tests. So there are interesting ways of looking at how we know our aims are being implemented, and research can be really helpful for that. For instance, through authorization of schools to offer IB programs, for instance, of accreditation of, for instance, international schools through agencies that offer that service, such as the Council of International Schools. In that context, making judgments about whether a school is doing what it claims to be doing. And again, my colleague Mike Fertig at the University of Bath is doing research in that sort of area. So there's all sorts of different areas in which research can be done. And one of the areas in which research can be done, and one of the sources of data in some really interesting research over recent years, has been the students themselves in schools. So here's an example of a project, and I mentioned this earlier in the session I led earlier today, a project that my colleague Jeff Thompson and I undertook in Mostar in Bosnia-Herzegovina a few years ago, evaluating the first 2 years of the United World College in Mostar, promoting the values of the United World Colleges and of the International Baccalaureate. And we were looking at the extent to which the college seemed to be meeting its aims over the first 2 or 3 years. There's another piece of research I was involved in with somebody from Mahindra United World College in India, evaluating student attributes before they began the IB diploma program and then after they'd completed the IB diploma program, to see to what extent there seemed to be evidence that the program had actually had an influence on them. There's a program, again, a project that I talked about a bit earlier today about the effectiveness of the CAS Creativity Activity Service program that's part of the IB Diploma Core that some colleagues and I implemented, completed last year. It's a piece of research that's looking at students' views of the experience of CAS. And then parents are always an interesting constituency, of course. What do parents think about what's happening? And we tend in schools to have an idea of what parents think about certain issues, but a piece of research can be really useful to make sure that we're not missing things because some voices are louder than others maybe. And a piece of research that asks parents what they think about particular issues can be really helpful in providing evidence in relation to specific issues that might be important. And these are some examples of people who've done research in the context of international and IB education. Jeff Thompson and I did some work with Peter Mackenzie in Switzerland about parents' reasons for choosing to send their children to international schools. I did a piece of work with Diana Potter in Buenos Aires about something similar. And one of our master's students undertook a piece of research last year in Mumbai about the extent, the reasons why parents actually chose the particular international schools in Mumbai for their children, and Peter Mackenzie did a piece of research in Japan. So that's a very quick run through all sorts of issues related to undertaking research in the context of schools, of education, many, many different areas that you could choose to focus on. There are issues, as I say, about making sure that you have the time if you're going to embark upon a piece of research, making sure that you have access to those that you would want to gather data from in undertaking your research. And I think there are many things that need to be borne in mind. But as I've put here particularly, don't forget that there are many different types of research and methodologies available, so we don't have to feel that we are limited to a particular form of research. Some methodologies lend themselves to large-scale projects, so sending out huge numbers of questionnaires around the world, for instance, which we can do now, of course, with online questionnaires. Some methodologies lend themselves much better to small-scale pieces of research, which might be conducted, as I've been saying, in individual classrooms by individual teachers who just want to find out something a bit more systematically about learning and teaching that's happening in a particular classroom. And they might do that through observation, but through a formalized form of observation where they actually record the data they're gathering. They might interview the students, possibly. I mean, that's always a possibility. And just a few examples before I finish. Some examples of relatively large-scale research, and these have been undertaken by, with some funding, and have been undertaken by groups of people, in these cases, in universities. So there's one you can see, the impact of the PYP exhibition on the development of international mindedness, critical thinking and attributes of the learner profile, that was undertaken by a number of researchers who completed that project last year. There's one on comparing MYP and non-MYP students' participation and performance in high school. So these I've chosen have got a particular sort of focus on IB type areas of the curriculum. The impact of CAS on students and communities I've already mentioned, and a piece of research here undertaken with support from the Jeff Thompson Research Award, which the IB set up a number of years ago in recognition of Jeff Thompson's contribution to international education. This is something that was done by Joanne Walker, who looked at the IB learner profile attributes in students after they'd completed the IB diploma. And then just a few examples to finish on of small-scale research, which might be more appropriate in the school context, the classroom context, for an individual researcher. And these are all examples of real pieces of research that I'm familiar with that have been undertaken. A teacher did a piece of research about how we can use digital games to improve learning in the IB diploma classroom. Somebody else looked at, as you can see, the impact and implications of service action projects abroad on international school students, again about CAS in the IB diploma. To what extent does the MYP prepare students for the challenges of the diploma programme? Which is always an interesting question about the relationship between the MYP and the DP. And this was specifically in a school in Italy. This one here is asking parents what they thought about the IB diploma programme 3 years after it was first introduced into a particular international school, and asking them if they thought it was what they had expected it to be. A critical review of the effectiveness of the virtual learning environment in a particular context with Year 5 IB students. And then you can see teachers' views on the implementation of the MYP in the context of a school in China. A study of the effects of teaching methods and teaching styles at the Koç School in Istanbul. This was an interesting one, looking at the fact that the school, in offering the IB, also had to teach the national curriculum in Turkey to prepare students for universities. So those are many different, well, not many, there are a few examples there of many different schools and many different teachers who'd engaged in pieces of research in a classroom context. And I really just want to finish by saying what I said at the very beginning. All educators can engage in educational research. We need to think about what's appropriate for our context. We need to think about why we're asking the question, how we will ask the question, what skills we have and what resources we have available to us. But in principle, research is something that all of us as educators, whether we're in schools or universities, can actually embark upon. So, thank you.